Hi, welcome to Mindful Conversations. My name's Greg Dwyer. My guest today is Dave Robbins. He's an author. He's also helping authors publish their own works. Dave, thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks, Greg.
This is pretty impressive. So how did you get the idea for this book?
Well, For Two-Tone DeSoto is actually the first in a series of what developed into two more books. They're sort of a loose series. They all stand alone.
Okay.
And the characters in the other two books are introduced here in the Two-Tone DeSoto as teenagers.
Okay.
In the subsequent two books, which take place during the 60s, the teenagers are sort of growing up and they're going to college. And so in the second one, one of the characters in this book goes to New York, and she's kind of getting a job and becoming a working woman in 1963. 64, and then in the last book, it's one of the characters in this book becomes a photographer, and he's a photojournalist working in Berkeley, and he goes to Vietnam. So it sort of covers that whole 1965 to 1968 thing.
I love it. You know, I was born in the 60s, and I know your focus is, the 50s and the 60s. And I mean, here's the anniversary of Apollo 11, right? Also Woodstock. There's a lot of things that happen. I'm a baby boomer. You're a baby boomer. How does a person become an author? You just sit down and say to yourself one day, I'm an author, like I'm a painter or I'm a doctor? How does it happen?
It would be nice if it worked that way.
Okay.
The fact is, if you're an author, you know it.
All right.
And when I was very young, I come from a family of writers. My grandfather was a rather sort of well-known author. Not a very nice guy, but he was a well-known.
What was his name?
Todd Robbins. He wrote The Unholy Three, and he wrote this short story that inspired the movie Freaks. So he was of that genre, the sort of the pulp genre.
Yeah.
But he did very well at it. And he went to Paris in 1926. He lived a couple doors down from Hemingway.
Wow.
They boxed together.
Wow.
He drank with Fitzgerald. Everybody drank with Fitzgerald.
So it's in your family, so there's a heritage.
It's in the family, yeah. But the current book I'm doing is about him, which starts with his experiences during the Lost Generation time, and then he goes to Hollywood in the 30s to make some movies. He comes back to France in the 40s during the Nazi occupation, and he ends up in a concentration camp for expatriates. So that's a pretty interesting story. But as far as the Two-Tone DeSoto is concerned, that starts out a series that takes place from 1960 to 1960, late 68.
All right.
And the Two-Tone DeSoto covers the Kennedy years, from 1960 to 1963.
Right.
And it starts out with the Nixon-Kennedy debates in October of 1960, and then it goes into his inauguration speech. And the books, this one in particular, is more about how there's a promise of a new generation coming, and you can sort of feel it. And as I look at it again today, I see there's so much similarity.
You said that on a radio show, Deja Vu, because I did a radio show with you a couple weeks ago. Yeah. You think the same thing is also happening right now?
I think, yes, but different.
And how is it different?
Well, back then, there was sort of a cultural awareness that it was more like the older generation clashing against the newer generation.
The 60s, yeah.
And the newer generation was developing a mind of their own through the promise of a president, or at least a sort of a time when they were coming out of their suburban environments and not so sheltered childhoods, but they were looking for something.
Right.
The music had gone stale. Their generation had gone stale. And it was the post-war, so everything seemed to be pretty, rolling along pretty well. I mean, I remember Eisenhower. He did a lot of golf playing. It wasn't much. It was probably a low sensory kind of presidency. Sure. Today it's totally different.
Right.
And there's a generation today that is trying to find itself through, a lot of sort of experimentation, but the idea that now we have Twitter and all of this thing, there's a whole new sort of, I think, a culture arising through an intellectuality that is somewhat different than was in the 60s, but it's very well, I think there's a lot of similarities.
Yeah, I was just in London last week, and I was sitting in a restaurant by myself, and there was a group of, 20, 30-year-olds sitting behind me, and they were just talking politics. And I thought to myself, you don't hear that coming from teenagers or 20-year-olds or 30-year-olds in America per se. You know, a lot of times people are on their phone, but there was like 6 of them all sitting around in this restaurant in London downtown, and they were talking about, you know, what's going on in London and the Brexit and all this other stuff. A very intellectual conversation. You know, speaking of Twitter, speaking of social media, and I don't know how much you want to talk about this because we certainly haven't rehearsed this. You mentioned John F. Kennedy. I'm thinking about, you know, Donald Trump. Whether you like him or not, I don't know. I don't know if you want to go down that rabbit hole, but what do you think about the fact that, you know, the president or anybody in power or anybody that's an influencer can actually send out a text and get a rise out of people? I mean, what's your thought about that?
That is such a great question, because since we did the radio interview 2 weeks ago, so much has changed. I mean,
well, I've changed your life? What do you mean?
You might have. But the thing is, as far as what's happening now, I mean, what was happening then versus what's happening now are 2 totally different things. We could have never imagined what went down in the last week when you were interviewing me 2 weeks ago, and so it's happening very quickly.
Right.
Unlike the 60s, where things sort of moved a little bit more slowly, the discouragement among the younger people then was more about the war in Vietnam and how it was unjust.
Yes.
Now it's different, because I think what's developing from this is that we have a culture that is actually trying to hold on to what we can of the Constitution and to keep our government the way it was with the Founding Fathers. And we see these violations happening in the name of the Constitution being, you know, sort of twisted around.
Well, that's the whole motto of Donald Trump. It's like "Make America Great Again," and I guess his new motto is something to do with the same thing. Do you remember what the new one is for 2020? It's very similar.
Keep America Great.
Yeah, you know. So it's this idea that we want to go back to maybe the 50s or the 60s, right? It's kind of reminiscent of the way things used to be, and I guess it does appeal to a lot of baby boomers.
Yeah.
No?
Well, America always has been great. We know this.
Right.
And there's no point in making it. The again is really kind of a misnomer.
Right, sure.
And it was just as great in the 60s as it is now. There's just as much opportunity back then for expression, and that's it, because we have these freedoms of expression.
Exactly.
No matter what we're expressing, people are listening. And whether it's through Twitter or through massive demonstrations like we had back then, this kind of cuts across all age limits too.
Right.
And in the 60s, it was more or less, you know, a lot of the college age kids were railing against, you know, the parents' philosophy and and how that was happening. And, you know, we had the hawks and the doves, and we had the, you know, the whole thing, generation gap, which is not true today. Today, it really doesn't cut across any gap. It's more, it's more ideologically spread, and we just don't know what's going to come out of this.
Right.
With the 60s, because we're now, you know, 50 years after, we can sort of look back and say, this is what came out of the 60s. Well, maybe on this one, we may be sitting back 40 years from now still wondering what came out of this.
So why do you have a fascination with this time frame? I mean, I grew up in 1962, so the 60s, I do remember some of it. Obviously, I remember more of the 70s. But why the fascination with the Kennedys and the Cuba War and that time frame? Why is that for you?
Well, I think certainly that aspect of the 60s may appear to be, on the surface, to be more optimistic.
Okay.
Certainly Kennedy was when he came out.
Yeah.
And certainly when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, basically Khrushchev blinked before he did.
Right.
And what happened was we came very close.
Yeah, we did. I heard that the other day.
Yeah,
we came very, very close.
Never have we been this close before. You know, you can talk about North Korea now, but we have never been as close as we were back then. So we can look back on it then and say, oh wow, he's a hero. You know, he did us. We are the great. You know, we are the great country.
Right.
It's like with what they're talking about today with the impeachment. This is not a happy time in our history. Not at all.
Now, I haven't been following it just because I don't want to get so misdirected into a lot of fluff and whether it happens or not. But do you have a strong feeling on whether it should happen or whether this is just crazy talk? What's your feeling on it?
If I had my druthers, I'd rather see it iron out with a legitimate election.
Okay.
I'd rather see it just go its course. The process.
And what do you mean by that? A legitimate election? What do you mean by that?
I mean an election where nobody's meddling in it.
Oh, I see.
Where we always think we do. We go to the polls, we cast our vote,
Right.
and we come out with whoever wins.
Right,
as
sure.
a popular vote.
Exactly. Oh, a popular vote versus the collegial vote, right?
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
And I think that there's a similarity that in the Kennedy years, the Kennedy was only 160,000 votes off of Nixon.
Really?
It was very close.
It
And
was
I
that
remember
close?
Yeah, they were counting on the radio for like a week after we were listening to the radio to see how the counts were coming in. So
Wow.
it wasn't declared
Right.
the day after he was elected.
Interesting.
So it's the same idea here. It was pretty close. It was actually arguably close. But with this one, I just see there's a number of similarities.
Yeah.
But there are also a lot of cultural shifts, as we talked on the radio show before, which could be which we could maybe get into later.
Sure. Oh, absolutely.
Because that's a little bit longer conversation.
Right.
But I think that the reason I chose the 60s, again, was because I think there are so many similarities. And I think by writing about the 60s in this way, my books are more or less maybe one half research and history books, like biographies or nonfiction books, and one half fiction. Because history is one of the characters in the book.
Now, so saying that, who's your audience? Like, who's your target market? Who are the people that would pick up your work and read it? Is it kids 20 years old, 30 years old, 50s, 60s? Who's your audience? Have you done some market research on that?
The big buzzword in publishing now is, what's your genre?
What's your genre?
What's
Well,
your
that's
genre?
nonfiction fiction, isn't it? Or is there more to
No,
that?
fiction is divided into so many different genres. There's sci-fi, romance,
okay.
Historical fiction,
I
which is
see.
loosely what this is.
Okay.
I call it contemporary historical fiction.
Right.
But there's a new one out. It's called upscale fiction.
Upscale fiction?
Yeah,
What's
that means
upscale fiction?
Fiction that is serious fiction. It's
Okay.
well written, but it's not what they used to call literary fiction, which fell into that before. But literary fiction is become more like beautifully written stuff without a plot.
I see. Yeah.
And also, of course, the classics are literary fiction too, and they have plots. But today's definition of literary fiction has changed. So now we have upscale, and that's what this is. Now, Two-Tone DeSoto is about kids, but I wouldn't recommend it. Well, I would recommend it for kids, older kids.
Right.
It's called, and they call it gritty young adult, and
Cool.
it's gritty. And young adult novels now really, they are young adults, which means they can take it from like 18 to 25.
Right.
So they are grown up, and they have middle school kids, which are that happens before the young adults become young adults. So there's a whole new. It's being sort of divided up as we speak, but nowadays genre is important, but not as important as the message in the book.
Okay, and so what's the focus? What's the message of this book? Is it hope? Is it what is it? You got to put a sentence on it. What would you say it was or is?
I would say, I guess my tagline is this is when innocence meets adulthood.
Wow.
And it's what happens. The clash is there. A lot of this is between kids back then and their parents back then.
Yeah.
Before it got really, flagrant later on in the 60s.
Sure.
These are just sort of the rumblings of that happening.
Wow.
But there's a comedic part to it too.
Oh, that's good.
So there's, one set of parents is pretty. They're pretty like comic relief, but
Neat.
But their kids end up, I think, being a bit more intelligent than their parents because they're starting to realize that they have a voice in this life, and in their life too. So,
Dave, how do people get a hold of you if they want to find out about the book or just find out about being a writer? How would they reach out to you on Facebook?
my website is dhrobbins.com.
Excellent. And so you went by DH. What does the H stand for?
Let the listener guess. No,
Well, you know what we could do is we could just hold it off until after the break.
we could.
Yeah, let's do
keep
that.
the suspense going.
Yes, we'll keep the suspense going. So we'll be back with D.H. Robbins after this commercial break. You're going to want to know what the H is all about. Welcome back to Mindful Conversations. My guest today is D.H. Robbins. I call him Dave, but officially on the book it says D.H. So what's the H stand for, Dave?
Well, it's really silly. But basically, what I did was when people asked me that a couple of years ago, I would sort of go into sort of whistling the theme song from the Frasier TV show.
Frasier? Oh, yeah.
And I keep them going and going and going. And one person got it right off the bat. The name is David Hyde Robbins.
Hyde? Oh,
and
yeah,
David
yeah.
Hyde Pierce played the part of Frasier's brother. Now,
I
don't
remember
know-
him.
I don't even know why I would do something like that. It was just something to keep the conversation interesting. But it's not a very it's a common name. So yeah, it's the reason that I kept DH was because there is a David Hyde Robbins out there, and he's written about 500 pulp westerns.
Okay.
So I didn't, if you go and search for me, he'll come up first with all of his books.
So Hyde is actually part of your name. I mean,
It's my
legitimate.
middle name.
Middle name.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So.
Okay, so that
and-
makes sense. DH, not to confuse yourself with the other guy.
Right. Because if you go by David Robbins, you're going to come up with a whole bunch of David Robbins authors. I mean, there's a lot of Robbins out there writing books.
Right. Okay. Well, let's talk about the process. I know one day I'd like to write a book. Maybe there's somebody out there that wants to write a book. I know you're going to start something up, helping authors. What's the process? What's the step? I mean, do you come up with the title first? Do you come up with the content first? Then you backpedal and then figure out what you're going to name the book? How do you do all of this?
The interesting thing about Tudor de Soto, the interesting thing about it was that when I was visiting a friend of mine, my second ex-wife, in Nebraska, I was visiting for the first time in Nebraska, and I was sitting there on her front porch,
Okay.
sipping lemonade, which is actually the opening scene in this book. And I was looking out past this glider swing, and I saw these two young girls walking beneath this fluttering line of laundry 3 stories up. It was a nice sort of crisp day like it is today, a fall day. And the thought came to my mind is, what is going through the minds of these kids?
Right.
Where are they going? Are they going to school? Are they going to, whatever? And that image stuck with me, and it led to this. I started out thinking, okay, who are these kids? Well, the 2 main characters in this book would have been these kids, and how they had developed a friendship and what have you. And it's just a simple little thing like that, some little image that you hang on to, which is enough to inspire you to sort of think it through, think it deep, think it on, you know. And from that, 3 books came.
Well, you mentioned something that really hits home. I was just in Ireland a couple weeks ago, and this woman gets off the bus, and we're talking about directions. And as she walks off the bus, she says, "Mind yourself." And I thought, well, I've heard "mind the gap," "take care." I've heard that all my life, but I've never said or heard anyone ever say, "mind yourself," right? So I thought to myself, the name of this television show is called Mindful Conversations. We also do one called Mindful Conversations After Hours. I thought that would be a great title for a book. Mind yourself.
Yeah.
In other words, you have to take responsibility for everything up here. You can't rely on someone else.
Exactly.
And I thought, what a catchy title.
Yeah.
But it was one event, one conversation on a trip to Ireland, and then I've been thinking about it for the last 2 weeks.
This is it.
That's it.
That's your book.
That's my book.
Okay.
Okay.
You'll be a Pulitzer.
Buy my book.
You'll be a
No,
Pulitzer
I'm
Prize
just
winning
kidding.
author in a year by this. You go.
Really?
No,
Okay.
seriously. If you got to be committed, and if you're a writer.
I should be committed.
Yeah. There's a difference. Writers are writers. You're a writer. I'm a writer.
Right.
I look at authors as writers are people that get paid to write.
Wait a minute. Authors are different than writers?
Yeah.
Now, tell me the distinction.
I look at writers. Writers are people that, like journalists, they get paid to write, and they have to write to a certain formula. They have to write to a certain word count, whatever.
Right. Okay.
And they do it for a living.
All right.
Authors are the ones who write novels and think in books such as this that by the sweat of their brow they put in 60-hour weeks, 80-hour weeks. And not knowing what they're going to come up with, and they're not getting a penny for it.
So they're passionate entrepreneurs,
It's
is what I hear you saying.
It's an absolute
Okay.
passion, and
Okay.
you need to know if you have that germ of being a writer in you.
Okay, so
And
let me look at this. This is, what, 300 pages?
Roughly.
All right, so
320.
this is 300 pages. How long, wow, this is nice typeset. How long did it take you to do 300 pages? A year, 2 years?
The Tutto de Soto took about 10 years to write.
Wait a minute, stop. 10 years to write
Yeah, I
this
started
book?
it in, I think I started it in 1988. It had a different title back then called Kids in the Corner. I didn't,
Why did it take so long to, 10 years?
Well, marriage just got in the way and the whole
Okay.
thing.
All right.
Got
Life
in the way.
gets in the
got
way.
in the way. And I did get remarried, and I wanted to concentrate more on
Okay.
nurturing that. And so writing is, if you're going to write, you have to realize it is going to take a lot of your time.
Right.
And loved ones sometimes don't like that time being taken. That can be traced back to Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald, actually.
What's the story behind that?
Well, Zelda wanted to be a writer.
Yep.
Scott was a writer.
I see.
And when he wrote, it took him away from her, and it took her away from him. And the thing is, they fed off one another.
Right.
And they weren't complete unless they were with one another. But he was uncomfortable writing around her. So that's why he didn't write a lot of books in the beginning. He wrote This Side of Paradise, and he wrote The Great Gatsby.
Right.
And he wrote the other ones that he wrote, Last Tycoon, whatever, that was later. But still, he started writing more profusely after Zelda. But the thing is, he and Zelda had this addiction to one another.
Wow.
And basically what it did was they sort of encroached on one another's sort of creative styles.
All right.
And as a result, the result was that, Scott was, had issues with that, but he drank a lot, she drank a lot. She was the jazz age. I mean, she was the one who defined it for women.
Sure.
And so that was kind of, it's an interesting story. In the case of Hemingway,
he wrote every day, didn't he?
Hemingway wrote every day.
I heard that he got up in the morning and he wrote from the time he woke up to like noon, no matter what, right?
And that time he spent from he got up until noon could be laboring over one word.
You know what? That's an artist.
Yeah.
And then he went to lunch. I don't know if he wrote in the afternoon, but I understand he kind of blocked out that time. I'm not going to spend 10 years writing my book. What about a ghostwriter? Do you believe in that?
No, I don't know.
You don't like that? No, you don't like that.
But as far as the other books are concerned, no, I did say, Two Tones of Soda Off and On took 10 years to write. The second one I wrote, The Reverend.
Tell me about this book called The Reverend. How did you come up with the title The Reverend?
Because it basically is about one of the characters in this book goes into New York. And, he's introduced in this book as one who kind of... he's a questionable character.
Okay.
And so he goes and he uses the power of his cloth.
All right. So he misuses his power.
He's a reverend, sort of, but he...
What do you mean, sort of? Either is he Catholic? Is he a priest? Is he a Methodist?
Well, he started out as Catholic.
He
follows the advice of his own inner God.
What does that mean?
It means that whatever that inner God tells him to do, it's like Son of Sam with the dog. Remember?
And it's kind of a dark thing.
Yeah, it's a dark inner God.
Wow.
And so what happens in my character's case, basically he's more woman than man. We all have that in us.
He's more woman than man?
Yeah, we all have this duality in us.
Sure. The feminine, the masculine.
And his feminine side rules him. So in order to sort of satisfy that feminine side, he will go out and he will, murder these women.
Wow.
Not with a knife.
Not with a knife,
but no. He feeds them communion wafers laced with LSD and convinces them that they have to die. It's a long story. You have to read the book.
How did you get the idea for this?
Like,
as
he's
who
dying,
inspired
as
you?
They're dying in his arms, he absorbs their soul to nourish his own. So that's the deal.
Now I know why you're a friend of Rich Sear.
Yeah.
Because Rich would love this idea.
He loved that book. Yeah. The whole thing, the idea is that it's also about him and his estranged daughter, who is also introduced in this book, and how she kind of tracks him down as being who he is. It's I won't give too much away.
Okay. And when's that book coming out?
That one's coming out in probably late January, early February.
Okay. So this is going to air December, January 2020. So, folks want to get
it'll be out
of
paperback and casebound, hardbound. But the third, that one only took maybe 4 years to write.
Okay.
The one I've just brought out, called The Weight of Indifference, which is my absolute favorite of the three.
Why do you like it the most?
I don't know. I relate to the guy. I went to school for photography. I always wanted to be a photojournalist.
Yeah.
My character's a photojournalist, and he goes to, he covers Berkeley, and then he covers Vietnam, and he didn't happen in real life, but he kind of stumbled upon the My Lai massacre.
Yep.
And no commercial journalist was there, but he was in my book, and he took pictures of it, and nobody believed the pictures. That's the end of the story. And so it's really about how the military has a tendency back then to sort of tell the journalists how to do their business. That's a long story, but the thing is that one only took me about 2 years to write, so I'm getting better at it.
Do you think that's true about the military influence?
Back then, it certainly was. Everything went through MACV.
Oh, it did?
Yeah, which is the, the military adjuncted.
So it was censored?
A lot of it was censored.
So today we talk about fake news. We talk about the fact that maybe, just maybe, Google and Facebook is limited certain posts. Do you think that's true too?
It's happening more and more, I think, and maybe they've been filtered in all sorts of ways since these things, as we now finding out.
Sure.
And I think back then, a lot of it was public relations about Vietnam, and a lot of it was. It wasn't so much about what we have today. Is this guy wants to get reelected at any cost, but back then, as you remember, Johnson he sort of dropped out of the running later on because of Vietnam, because of Walter Cronkite went on and gave a very scathing report about his experience in Khe Sanh. And after that, Cronkite was Johnson's closest friend in the media, and then Johnson dropped out because he lost the media. Right.
Yeah, it's all about the media. And I mean, whether you like the president or you do, I will tell you this. My personal opinion is he knows how to work the media. He knows how to get reaction, and I think that's what he's done. So,
interesting.
Dave, how do folks get a hold of you? I know we only have a few minutes left. Do they go to D.H. Robbins? Do they go to Dave Robbins?
It's all one word. D.H. Robbins, no periods. D.H. Robbins, www.dhrobbins.com. And everything's there. And
the website is that?
It's got excerpts from the books. It's got links to order them, the whole thing. Actually, if you, I shouldn't say it. I'm not releasing the Reverend till January.
Till next year.
But you can still get it.
Yeah.
It's still there. It's out there now. If you
Excellent. Want. Well, that's good. Well, listen, I really appreciate this. If anybody wants to reach out and get to know you, especially if they want to write a book, you'd be the guy.
Please do.
You can help them.
If you want some advice on how to get your book published and how to write your book, how to get it started, because there's a book in everybody.
Excellent.
Let me know.
Well, Dave, I really appreciate your time. I hope we gave you something to think about here on Mindful Conversations. Until next time, mind yourself. Dave, thank you so much.
Thanks, Ray.